Recording. Okay, so welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is a guest lecture by Terhi Fuller from Australian National University. Dr. Terhi is a lecturer of digital humanities at ANU, and her areas of expertise include linked data, ontologies, websites. Terry, you can elaborate on that later. Terry today is going to offer a lecture on data in digital humanities to the students of DH at IIT Jodhpur, and we're very happy to have Terry with us today. Thank you, Terry, again. So without further ado, I would welcome Dr. Terry to start her lecture. After the lecture completes, we would be taking up the questions and answers. Okay, over to you, Terry.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and, to talk about things that I actually feel really passionate about, and something that I love talking about data, and I love talking about digital humanities, and I absolutely love talking about data in the digital humanities. So this is a perfect lecture. And it's so fantastic to have this opportunity to talk to you all. Let me see if I can change my slides, there we go. So my plan for this lecture is to give you a little bit of context to the way in which I think about digital humanities and the way in which I think about data, but also, I'm not really here to give you any answers. I'm sorry. I don't see that as my job. I see it, my job is to encourage you to engage in that kind of independent thought that makes everyone into good scholars. So I'm sorry in advance if there are no easy answers. But to give you some context about my perspective, it's I thought I would tell you a little bit about me and my research. I would introduce you to the Centre for Digital Humanities Research at the Australian National University in which I work. And because talking about these kinds of things in the abstract can be very tricky, I wanted to show some examples of the types of projects that I and my colleagues and my students work on. Then, having set the scene with that context, my plan was then to dive into the topic of the lecture, to define what data is in the digital humanities, and to sort of question as to why that is even, why is that even a thing to discuss? Why isn't this completely obvious? I want to touch on the topics and ideas of structured data and of unstructured data, and my great love in life, which is metadata. And then I'm going to talk about terms that we hear in conjunction when we talking with about data. So terms like big data, open data, linked data, data lakes, data deluge, those sorts of terms. And then, as a bit of a spoiler, I'm going to come to my crescendo of my presentation, which is this grand revelation that when it comes to data, it's not the size that matters, but the complexity of it. And my aim is to cover all of that in 50 minutes. Well, wish me luck. Followed by 20, 25 minutes, however long everyone's willing to talk, of a question and answer session. So I hope everyone's happy with that plan.
It sounds great.
Excellent. Oh God, I love having feedback. Thank you. Please talk to me. Everyone is welcome to talk to me throughout the presentation. So first, I'm going to set the scene with context and perspective, because they inevitably, the context in which I work and live, because my job is my life, they influence my perspectives and my opinions on things. So I am a very interdisciplinary researcher. I have a background in very traditional humanities subjects of ancient history and archaeology, and of studying the ancient languages of Mesopotamia, so roughly modern day Iraq. But right now in my current life, as it were, I am often describing myself as a linked data methodologist. So I do and play with linked data, and I argue passionately about the semantic web. It's not the only thing that I do. I also work in some other digital technologies. I use different tools. Lots of my students, they are very excited right now about 3D modeling, virtual reality. So I have upskilled in these technologies alongside them. But truth be told, my heart is in projects which have been quite diverse in terms of there's old Babylonian literature, there's been, early English print, there's been jazz performances from the 1930s, classical Chinese literature, and even book trade of banned books in France. But what I always look at is how metadata can be used to create linked data. So how the information that we have about historical things can be used to create a machine navigable graph, a machine processable graph based on the relationships and the connections that exist between things. So I don't really study the beautiful, exciting, wonderful, fascinating historical things in the universe. I only care about the connections between them and trying to make those machine readable. I try to limit where I can, and it's not always possible, but where I can, I try to limit my work into using open data to try and support researchers and scholars who are willing to share their data openly. And I try and use open source software, again, where I can. Partially, though, that's not choice. Because linked data is quite a new technology, in some ways there even aren't a lot of proprietary tools out there. A lot of these are tools that have been built to solve a particular problem. And yes, of course, because I use open data and I use open source software, then I see it as my duty to produce more of the same, to try and give more to the research community in terms of giving more ideally linked open data into the universe. Just a little side note about my slides. I have a color coordinated set of notes, which is the white text is the thing that's the serious thing. The blue things are the links to encourage you to go and have further readings. I'll make the slides available so you can have them and you can look at them, revisit them whenever you want. And then the orange things tend to be things like little additional comments or notes, because I make a lot of jokes for myself in my slides. Often my students do not find me particularly funny, so I sort of put little explanations in there. So if the orange text is weird, just ignore it. Not a problem. So that's me. I guess the thing to know about digital humanities in general, which I'm sure you all know this, is that digital humanities has been around, okay, some people will say around a decade or so, like it's a really new discipline. And some people will say it's been around since the 1930s when Father Buser started using IBM's machines to do text analysis. I mean, this is not something that I don't think it makes that much of a difference how long the discipline has been around, which might sound like a weird thing, but it's such a diverse field and such a broad church, includes so many different methods, approaches, and areas of specialization that I think you can find a start point for just about anything. Like, I could argue that the revolution of making Sumerian literature machine readable started at the onset of my PhD thesis because no one else had ever done it before. So then that subdiscipline started in 2015, right? So there are different ways to interpret that. So often people like to describe DH as quite a young discipline, but what we undoubtedly have seen is that there has been, I think, quite a steep increase in the popularity of digital humanities as a degree and as a thing to study, both at undergraduate level and at postgraduate level. And that's really happened, I would say, in the last decade or so. So I would say maybe 10 years ago, it was quite easy to say that you were the only digital humanities department in a country. I think in the last decades, that's become much harder because everyone's got a program or a certificate or something, which is amazing for our discipline. But it means that we kind of, all of us need to find that unique angle and niche that we are good at, like where our strengths lie. For us at the Centre of Digital Humanities Research in Australia, and yes, this is a genuine photograph from our campus where we get kangaroos. It does happen. Come to Australia if you don't believe me. You can stay at my house. We have a very small centre. We only have 3 academic teaching staff, and then we have some postdocs, research associates, PhD students and students. Well, we're a really small centre, so we really have to maximize on what we can do and how we can make our research contribute to our teaching. And that's really fundamental in the sort of things that we do. So one of the things that we do to make ourselves special and important, as it were, is that we offer a degree program, which is a master's in digital humanities. But it's not just the digital humanities, it's a master's in digital humanities and public culture. And a huge part of that is our collaborations with the GLAM sector. So galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. And my students and my colleagues' students are tasked with building prototype projects inspired or based on or showcasing material like cultural heritage materials from different museums, libraries, and galleries. So far, we've collaborated with the National Museum of Australia, the British Library, and the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia. The students have almost entirely like free reign to do whatever they want. There are very few parameters, so we say it has to be based on the cultural heritage collections, and it needs to somehow be online so that it will have some online component. And ideally, there needs to be some attempt of engaging with the public beyond academia. And this has been a really great space for a lot of very innovative, project building and creative endeavors, but it's also an excellent eye-opening example of the way that data in digital humanities can be just about anything. And this is the point that I will get back to momentarily. So to stand out from the crowd of DH, we have this public culture aspect. It also means that we have a slightly different approach to things like how we care about impact and engagement. We're very collaborative in our research, and we work very much in a space of visual culture and heritage. I'm sort of showcasing some of the things that our students have been working on and doing with, and some of our international and GLAM sector collaborators here. To reflect the fact that our students are not really engaged extensively in what I would describe as domain-specific research. So my students are not they're not historians of a particular era. They are not, connoisseur art historians of a particular style. They are not computational linguists who are experts in a given corpus. Rather, our center and our students are all tasked with becoming methodologists. We want them to learn skills and, kind of develop this ability to critically evaluate a given method or approach for its strengths and its weaknesses. And as a part of that, we've just recently launched this website called Methodology, but with a clever spelling mistake in the middle, which we highlight in red to show DH. It's not a feature. No, it is a feature. It is a feature, not a bug. That's what I mean. And we did this because we kind of wanted to show how different methods and skills and approaches from one discipline can be applied in the context of another, and how the roles of our students is to be able to not just upskill in a particular area, but to critically evaluate that and to kind of see the beauty of all of this, which is that it almost doesn't matter what your data is, because your skills and approaches can be applicable across so many disciplinary silos and categories. It's partially informed by my experiences in that I developed a linked data project during my PhD in the ancient history space, but then for my postdoc, I worked on early English print and digital musicology, things like opera and operatic performance, Wagnerian opera actually, which I'm not personally a fan, but the research was quite interesting. So what I sort of learned from that is that knowing the technological method, but having an appreciation and understanding of the nuances and the challenges that humanities data in general presents, that was a combination that meant that as a digital humanist, I was like more applicable to different kinds of research agendas than I would have been if I had just specialized in one niche area. And so here are some of the examples that our students do. They do VR environments, augmented reality apps, 3D modeling. For some reason, which I love, my students are really into building games and having like learning through play be a huge part of the projects that they build. So there are often things like treasure hunts, board games with digital components, choose your own adventure games, like little hypertext novels where you choose the path that you navigate through the game. You read a text and then you have choices and you click on one and it takes you to a different page. I love those. I suspect that's why my students make them, because they have learned how to influence me, I suspect. But even in the staff of the CDHR, the Center for Digital Humanities Research, we deal with so many different types of data and so many different types of projects. Linked data is my tool of choice, but my colleagues work in things like machine learning. One of my close colleagues is an expert in digital mapping. We have all, through our students' project, upskilled in 3D scanning and AR and VR. And I've included some of the projects that we've worked on collaboratively onto the slides. And when I share the slides, you're of course more than welcome to go and have a look at them and get a slightly better idea of what those projects are. I could talk about the data to each of these projects and the interesting things that we found out about each of them. In the question and answer, if people want to revisit this, I'm very happy to come back here. We do also, I know we talked about this and I said I wasn't going to talk about privacy, ethics and trust at length, but I couldn't just skip the topic. It's so fundamentally ingrained into me. So this is some of the topics that I cover in my teaching. So we talk a lot about data generated by us as people, as part of the quantified self movement. We talk a lot about how data can be used in digital humanities projects to inadvertently invade people's privacy. We also look at ways in which data can be used in a harmful way, nefariously, or perhaps inadvertently, in the case of something like death and dying online, where the data produced by the person who has passed away is not available to the family when it should be, or there are things that they discover about a past family member that they didn't know when the person was alive, and then the privacy is sort of violated posthumously, and we sort of discuss things like whether or not that's a consideration to have. But basically, a lot of the things that we do is we look at the way web and society interact and humanities and technology interact, but all of these different sources also provide us with either methods or data, or in many cases, both. Oh, this is just me bragging. I have really cool PhD students and I love them. So they just work on really cool topics. So Cynthia, who's there on the sort of left, in the photo with me on the edge, she works on looking at how people's posting on different social media platforms could be used to identify people who are experiencing complex grief patterns and whether we can identify people who are at risk. And Robert, who's there in the middle, he uses data from the EVE online video game to model human behavior, which he then applies to real world crime. And he looks at if there's matching patterns. I just think that's really cool. And it also serves to illustrate my point, is that anything can be data in the digital humanities. Video game timestamps, tweets, and Facebook posts, anything at all. And so to kind of round off the description of the working environment in which I sort of, live, we collaborate extensively with international partners and are always keen to try and find ways to connect with other digital humanities students and researchers anywhere in the world. So I just wanted to add this as, oh my God, how thrilling to be able to add all of you into this as well. Our students do come from extremely diverse backgrounds. I'm not going to say it's not sometimes challenging when students come to me and they say, which Python script should I use to do text analysis of this piece of literature that's written in classical Chinese? And I say, I don't know. Which Python scripts should you use? And then they say something like, well, I found this one. Can I use this one? And I say, sure, that seems like a wonderful thing to try. And so I feel like there's so much richness and fun, frankly, in this kind of multilingual international way of working together. But that then explodes that space of what constitutes data, because then all bets are off, all language barriers, all cultural barriers, everything becomes data. And yeah, because we deal with a lot of stuff, we also want to diversely upskill our students in various different ways. One of the things that I feel very passionate about is that I don't give my students instructions that they can follow, which sounds a bit mean, but the way I think about it is, if I tell them what they're looking for, if I tell them what they need to learn to see, or if I tell them where to click and when to print, the risk is that they will just learn to follow my instructions rather than learn what they need in order to be able to upskill or deliver on these different skills. So that's the context in which I operate. that is the context which informs my view of the topic of data in the digital humanities. So I don't know if you encounter this very often, but I should have said this. My interdisciplinary research center sits in the College of Arts and Social Sciences rather than computer science. So my experience of working and publishing in the digital humanities was in an interdisciplinary research center that was within a computer science department for my PhD. I then went to a different interdisciplinary research center in a different computer science department for my postdoc. And then when I got my lectureship, I was in an interdisciplinary research center in a humanities setting. So it had been more digital, and now suddenly it's humanities. And in some ways, the work I do is exactly the same, but I feel like there is a difference created by the expectations of the people around me. So this can be something very specific. So during my postdoc, my supervisor wanted me to publish in computer science conferences so that there was a quick turnaround, quick rate of publication. Now that I'm in a humanities setting, my boss wants me to write a book. And I'm just sort of sitting here going, can I write 200 conference papers instead, please? And he's like, no. so, the expectations have kind of changed. But what has also been different is the attitude to data and problem solving that the people around me are used to operating in. And one of the things that comes through from the shift into a College of Arts and Social Sciences is this observation that a lot of my humanities scholars approach the material that they work with in a slightly different way than my colleagues in computer science. One of the things that has taken me about 4 years to do is to train my students and my colleagues and my boss to talk to me in a way that I can understand what they mean. So this means things like everybody agrees that what we have is data, even though the historians and the art historians, and to some extent the social scientists, don't necessarily want to call it data. They want to call it something else: material, subject, expertise. It's all the same thing, though. It's the focus of your analysis. And I wanted to include these two screen grabs of these blog posts. They are not brand new. So the LA review of books is from 2012, and the Miriam Posner blog post is a few years later, I think 2014. But I think that they illustrate the point really well, that digital humanities sometimes has a challenge of working with and supporting and diversifying and enriching research where there is a fundamental clash in the way that we talk about things. So the blog post or the article on the left is a very strong and passionate argument in that literature, as an example of something in the humanities, should not be considered data. So he has very strong sentences in there, like, literature cannot meaningfully be treated as data. Literature is the opposite of data. And I love including this example because actually he mentions the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the case study examples for my PhD. So I feel like that's, he wrote this for me. But he makes this case that the things that are important about humanities scholarship are the things that no computational program could ever do. Or if it can or when it can, then humanity is doomed. Like, humanities scholarship is the one thing that sets us apart as something different. And I guess in this guy's view, something better than a machine. The argument on the right is to say, I see what this guy means in his slightly fire and brimstone sort of approach. He's very extreme in his views. He's very critical of the digital humanities as a thing. But Miriam has a sort of more understanding approach, where she kind of says, like, I appreciate that you don't see your material as data, but I do. But at the same time, I understand that there are implicit things and tacit knowledge about your material, which you might not have explicitly articulated. So in some ways, that might not be present in the data set. And at the same time, it doesn't negate the fact that what you have is in fact data, even though it's not in a spreadsheet. And she gives this wonderful analogy about how if you had a family album, a family photo album, and somebody said it's a collection of images, it's like, well, like, technically that's not wrong. Like, it is a collection of images, but that's not what makes that album special or important or worthy of analysis. There are other things other than the number of images, the sizes of the images, and the topics of the images that make that collection, that corpus of image, somehow socially, culturally, and sort of individually, emotionally significant as an object in the universe. So any discussion of data in the digital humanities, I think, needs to recognize that there is, I don't think it's as bad anymore, but there is a history of a disjointness where the humanities part of digital humanities might not feel that they have any data to contribute at all. And then you could argue that there can be no data in the digital humanities, because if there is no data in the humanities, how could there be data in the digital humanities? I, of course, strongly disagree with this. This is not my argument at all. In fact, my argument is the opposite. My argument is that everything is data. Everything. And for DH people, more so than anyone else. And I will elaborate on that point. So we know that people do research in text, like in text analysis, like Father Boosas, or any kind of bag of words analysis, or if you know things like, gosh, Voyant tools or Mallet, or, topic modeling things, then there's a lot of tools out there for text analysis. We can understand that any text is something that we can analyze using computational methods. We can publish it at a digital humanities conference. Text is definitely a type of data in the digital humanities. Fantastic. It's not the only thing. Music is as well. Lots of papers written on digital musicology, analysis of digital signals, things like that. And of course, projects based on images, different kind of websites for different kinds of browsing, sort of alternatives to traditional searches. People make images. Did anyone see, hypothetically, because I guess everyone's camera's off, but a few weeks ago there was a big outroar because there was a paper published in Nature that used historical paintings to basically do like a face recognition run a face recognition algorithm over it, and then draw some conclusions about what facial features are traditionally seen as trustworthy. I mean, everyone who I know got really mad at that paper, but we can discuss that. My point is, images can constitute data in the digital humanities, and so too multimedia, and certainly in my case, metadata. I think the most exciting thing about any museum is the objects collection, and the database that holds the information about the objects is the most important thing for me. But that's just one level of data in the digital humanities. We've actually got a lot more. So in the case of some of the projects that I mentioned before, my students created a website, which is a game, or choose your own adventure hypertext novel. So that website, that game in itself could be analyzed, evaluated, used in user studies. It would become data. I mean, the students had to write a report about it. But there are things that are composites to that website. The images that inspired the project that are in the British Library, the original animations and drawings that the students drew to include in the site. So that's at least 3 different types of data that each could be analyzed in their own right in a digital humanities context. Perhaps more straightforwardly, if we think about Nathan's the one in the blue shirt in the photo. The guy on his knees is Kieran. He's experiencing being inside an ancient Italian tomb where he felt that the roof was so low that as a tall guy, he had to lean down to fully feel the space. Nathan made a VR installation that Kieran is experiencing. So that's one bit of data that's been produced, could be evaluated, analyzed, looked at. But there were 2 prior steps before that of what I would, I guess in this context, refer to as raw data. So he took hundreds of 2D photos of the space, of the tomb itself. Those need to sit somewhere and be kept as a collection so that if the VR environment ever needs to be recreated or someone wants to recreate it, that raw data needs to be archived and kept somewhere. That is now a data set that he has collected, right? He produced 3D models of the room, which then got deployed in a VR environment. So to me, that's again at least 3 different types of data that have been produced in one digital humanities project. And then the examples go on and on. We have metadata examples. There are different types of projects that we use to do different kinds of data. But what we do every year is we also run a user testing event where the students, not we, I don't do anything, the students showcase the projects that they have built to other students, staff members, collaborators from the GLAM sector, and we do user evaluations. So every semester we produce more data about these projects because we now have the user evaluation data as well. And because we keep repeating it year after year, there's also scope for longitudinal study. So everything is data in the digital humanities, I guess, is the point there. But that, I think, in some ways is quite a straightforward data set. Like having 200 photographs is still a tangible, quantifiable, measurable set of data, which in a way makes it lovely and comfortable and familiar. And maybe just between you and me, maybe just a little bit boring because we know how to measure and work with that kind of data. Where I think the humanities side of digital humanities really kicks in a most exciting way is when we start looking at unstructured data as the data that we work on. So what's unstructured data? Okay. The examples I like to use are things like the narrative structure of a text, where each version of the book or the manuscript is a physical manifestation of an abstract notion. But really, the thing that you're studying and working with is that abstract idea, which could manifest in just about any. Like if we think about, gosh, like some like well-known story, like I'm blanking here. I'll use a culturally specific one for me, like Little Red Riding Hood. Like there are millions of different books that capture the story. They're all largely similar, but they're all also different from each other, because otherwise they wouldn't have got published. Right? Another thing that I love to think about is the melody of a piece of music. And I don't mean the digital signal that records it. I don't mean the video that captures a particular performance. I mean the abstract flowingness of a thing which gets represented in some musical score and then reproduced by a person playing an instrument. Also, we can talk about things like content of images, experiences of engaging with multimedia, and of course, my great love, metadata, which can be an extremely interesting bit. I have added it into unstructured data. I actually think it sits somewhere maybe between structured and unstructured data, because if you capture it in a knowledge graph that has structure, even though it's not hierarchical linear structure. So I'm calling it a sort of in between. But this is the kind of thing that I think makes digital humanities data complicated to work with, but also where the excitement of it is for me. So in a lot of ways, I think digital humanities data is all of these things. It's structured in some ways, it's unstructured in others. It's messy, by which I don't mean dirty, I mean unstandardized and chaotic. And I will show you an example in a minute. Digital humanities people, I think, have to accept the fact that you will work with data sets that are incomplete. There are aspects of it that are ambiguous, and we can talk about examples of these later. Historical data inevitably includes unknown components, because if it did, we wouldn't be searching this. Sometimes the whole joy of the matter is that something is debated and argued about, and it even remains unresolved. So there are examples of scholarship and sort of attitudes, even in things like Wikipedia, where the solution is that there is no consensus on the topic. Things with art that might get destroyed, art that is developed only for the purposes of being temporary, and in things like music, which as soon as it stops being played and stops being heard, it disappears from the universe. Humanities data, and as an extension of that, digital humanities data can be extremely ephemeral, and it's just gone. And the closest approximation that you have then is whatever it was that you were able to capture that. Like, for example, the structured data of a set of timestamps for a digital signal that captures the melody. I think that makes digital humanities stuff really awesome and really interesting, makes it really fun to work with, also makes it really difficult to work with, because everyone knows this. It's easy to work with data that's structured, complete, very tidy, very highly curated, and completely unambiguous. And I think digital humanities data is essentially, by its very nature, none of those things. So I wanted to talk briefly about this one example of a project. Let me just check if I put an animation. I did. To validate what I said about digital humanities data being messy and complicated and terrible, I wanted to show this example of the Elephant project, which I worked on during my postdoc. It is a linked data project that brings together the HathiTrust digital library from the US, which is a very large digital library of books and content that are available from various US and international libraries, and the Early English Books Online, which is a very small but very well curated collection of volumes and texts that have been published in English between 1473 and 1699. So on the one hand, you have a huge data set, millions of volumes, like 20 million volumes now. And on the other hand, you have this collection of just 25,000 very finely curated records. It was not my job to work on the HathiTrust data, it was to work on the Early English Books Online. And within those 25,000 records, there were 98 distinct expressions of author date, so of just one kind of date specifically related to the author. There were over 1,500 distinct expressions of publication date. So that's different from the author date. There were 22 distinct types of information in the headers, 700 unique places, and about 6,500 unique expressions of person. So even within such a small data set, the diversity of the data, the messiness of it, and the incompleteness was immense. So that then gets me to these issues of big data, open data, and linked data in the digital humanities. These terms often get used together, and I am not even sorry about the horrifically bad nerd joke in the slides. I love sci-fi, and every chance I get a chance to talk about data, there is at least one Star Trek reference. I'm sorry, it's not funny, but I have to be true to myself. Big data, open data, linked data all get talked together in lots of ways, I guess because they all have the word data in the name. And I think we fall into this trap of thinking that they're very similar things, but when we start to deconstruct that, I think we actually find that they are all very different things. So to me, big data is a concept. It's often debated what exactly constitutes big data, and can humanities datasets ever be big enough to even meet the category of being big data and applicable to that field of research and things like that. Open data is much more of an idea, you know, it's a philosophy, it's a publication paradigm. It's not really a concept in the same that big data is. There are very clear criteria as to what constitutes open data. There are different standards of openness that you can either, you know, meet or fail to reach. Linked data, on the other hand, is a method. It's a way of doing things. It's a process of publishing data online in a machine-readable format using existing web architecture. It doesn't really have anything to do with a concept or a noble idea. It's just a tool or a method. So are any of these things relevant to digital humanities? Well, I would say big data is, because Professor Dave DeRoe from the University of Oxford, who used to be my boss, gave a paper a few years ago where he said any data sets that too big for you to hold in your mind at any one time must constitute big data, because you are unable to just process it in your mind. Is open data relevant to the digital humanities? Absolutely. I think digital humanities people do a lot of work in publishing data openly and also using it openly, and that is, or using data that's been made available openly, and that is a wonderful thing. As for linked data, I think linked data as a method is, and I am biased because it is my method, but I think it's a wonderful method for digital humanities people, because humanities scholarship is often about connecting ideas, events, people, things together. Linked data allows you to do that in a way that doesn't force you to apply reductionist methods or forcing hierarchical knowledge structures onto things that simply aren't hierarchical. I don't think you can really capture the nuanced relationships between people in a social group by putting emotions and relationships into a hierarchy. I love the decentralized network aspect of linked data because I think it mirrors in a digital space the humanities thought process to an absolute T. And that kind of gets me to my point about why data in the digital humanities is amazing, but also what the main point of it is. And that is, it doesn't matter if it's not open. It doesn't matter if it's not big. The thing about digital humanities data is that it's always complex. Interconnectedness is what most humanities scholars care about. And I think as digital humanists, we care about that as well. I think human beings in general are kind of network thinkers. And I think that there is no reason why a digital humanist couldn't approach their data in a way that maintains and explicitly categorizes those kinds of network connections between the data sets rather than reducing that complexity down into forcing data into like a spreadsheet. I think this is a point that might seem completely obvious to you. And, you know, great, good. That means you're smart people with an excellent lecturer. But often what I see in the actual manifestation of digital projects is that somewhere along the way, the maintenance and the keeping of the nuanced complexity of the data becomes seemingly insurmountably difficult. And then we have a tendency to default into things that make our databases possible or manageable or something like that. So one of the things that I have struggled with a lot with our technical developer is that whenever I have an incomplete data set for dates, she wants to default January 1st because she's like, then we know that January 1st means that the information wasn't there. But unfortunately, often my data is not that clear cut. There are also challenges of things like different calendars when you work in a historical space. Is it the Julian or the Gregorian? And when did it change? Was it March or was it April? So arbitrarily assigning data to fill in gaps to make the system work, I think is much more problematic as a consideration when working with digital humanities data than you might even realize without having explicitly thought about it. And that actually gets me, I have a couple of slides, but I realize that I'm basically over time anyway. So I'll just say legacy data is something that we kind of need to think about as well. That's a huge thing in DH. I think we're looking at a bit of a generational shift where a lot of our senior colleagues who have worked in non-digital methods have a lot of analog material, which we will look to need to digitize in the future. Sure, that's happening now in terms of, you know, people's sort of, for you and me, for us, most of the stuff that we do as academics is born digital anyway. But our supervisors and the senior academics who are on their way out, their work is annotations on bits of paper and on cards and on notes. And if we don't keep that, we will lose that wealth of information. And that means that there is essentially generations of potentially digital humanities data, which doesn't really exist yet because it's only in analog form. The solution, I guess, in the short term is that you produce a lot of PDFs. But then you get into the problem of trying to mine PDFs, and then you get into a data lake sort of issue, and then you need like $10 million and 20 people in your research staff and a large grant and the Nobel Prize or something. And then another consideration of that is a lot of projects only last for 5 years. So even if you have a fantastic digital humanities project now, in 5 years' time, that's going to be legacy data, and that's going to be a legacy data problem because there's no one to maintain your site. It needs to be stored, archived. There's no one updating for software updates or operating system updates. That's going to be a potential problem. So then we need a good data management plan. I won't bore you by talking about a data management plan. I'll just leave the slide up so that you can read about it afterwards and then be bored when I'm not online, which is, I think, an excellent solution to the problem of time running out. And that basically gets me to the end anyway. So if I just skip the most boring slide, that's probably the stuff that'll be on your exam now or something. But we can certainly talk about that later. But I will finish now so as not to go too much over time. And thank you.